I've long suspected that NAR prophets and apostles are essentially performing magic tricks. They're doing mentalism. That's the illusion of having psychic or prophetic powers. And I wanted to ask, I mean, you've already hit on this, but have you observed any similarities between how magicians and mentalists perform their tricks and how NAR prophets claim to prophesy, claim to heal people, claim to work other miracles, such as the so-called glory cloud that was making appearances at Bethel Reading some years ago, or even the manifestations of gemstones and gold dust that allegedly occurs in these NAR meetings? What type of similarities have you observed?
Yeah, well, I would say first off, it's mostly the mentalists that do the readings like I would do on stage and do the things like I just did with you. And also that's called in mentalism, that's called Q&A, question and answer. And question and answer routine is by most mentalists considered the strongest mentalism effect you can do because it floors people. It's just how could he know or how could she know those things that I didn't tell anybody about? So that's like a closer. You know, you can't get much stronger than that. So that's what I see mostly. That's what's always caught my attention. The physical manifestations, the gold dust glitter. I mean, I understand how that could be done, but magicians, I'll give you a good example. David Copperfield would do a story, and this a lot of times he closed his show with this in Vegas. He would talk about his grandfather and snow, and there was a story about the snow. And he would, if I've got his routine correct here, he would tear up a piece of paper, a little piece of paper. I think he put it in a glass of water, squeezed it out, started to do this, and all of a sudden, out of his hands, all this like snow would start to appear, just filled, just unbelievable, come out. And there's other magicians who do that. So that could be akin to the gold dust. It's just done a different way. Again, somebody who presents something in a very, what I want to say, a serious way, no matter how ridiculous it might be. When somebody presents something in a very serious way, people will fall for it. It's as simple as that. I have done something. I have a vase and I have water in it. And I pour all the water out, and then I talk about, this ability that a lady had back in the 1800s where she could do certain things, and one of the things was that she could produce water. We don't know how she did it. Now, this is a story I'm making up, that she could produce water, and we don't know, was it from the condensation, whatever. And then I take the vase and I turn it over and more water comes out. Shake it empty. It's empty. I can hold it over somebody's head. They can look up and it's empty. Put it back down. I say, but she was able to do it. And I'll put a piece of cardboard over it, and take the cardboard off it. And I pour more water out of it. Now, that's a magician's trick. But I saw the amazing Kreskin use that as a so-called psychic phenomenon, because he wasn't always saying that he was a trickster. He wouldn't really admit that. He'd leave things up to your own mind in a lot of ways, Now, when I perform my show, The Extrasensory Deception of Terry Holley, I say, I'm going to recreate fraudulent psychic phenomena, and I will use every possible natural means that I have to make you think I'm doing a supernatural act here. And so I go, so from this point on, I'm now a psychic. And then I go into my show. And I give what's called a disclaimer. I tell people I'm not psychic. I don't have these abilities. There are others in the profession that say, when you make a disclaimer, it really hurts your show. Don't make a disclaimer. Just leave people wondering, about it. As my worldview, I choose to make a disclaimer because I've seen what can happen if you don't make a disclaimer.
Okay. And so do you believe that Pharaoh's magicians had real supernatural power, maybe demonic power, or were they simply replicating tricks when they replicated the miracles that God performed through Moses?
That's a great question. That's a question, again, that's one of those questions that it's like for people, it's like, I've got you kind of thing. They come up to me, I know I got you. What about Pharaoh's magicians? And I answer it with a theological perspective. And actually, one of my professors in seminary asked me that question, and I explained it to him. And when I gave the explanation, he said, I never thought about that. And he was the president of a seminary. And here's how I answered. Can anyone other than God create life? And I've only had one person say yes. Most, especially Christians, would say, well, no, only God can create life. And I go, yeah, I agree. Only God can create life. But if I take this pencil here and I turn this piece of wood that is not living, it's a dead stick, so to speak. If I turn this into a snake, what have I done? In my opinion, I've created life. Because that snake has organs, it has cells, it has all this. The second thing the magicians did is they turned water to blood. Now, blood is teeming with living cells. Water is H2O. It's an element. It doesn't have living cells in it. So if they took water and they changed it into blood, they did a miracle. By Satan, they turned an inert element into a living substance, into blood, teeming with cells. So because I don't believe this is theological for me. I don't believe it's also logical to a degree. I don't think that they did that. I think they were magicians because they eventually got to the point where they couldn't do anymore, and they admitted about God's the only one who can do this. So I just think it's a trick. And people say, "You mean they turned a stick into a snake?" I said, in Vegas years ago, before PETA, people for the ethical treatment of animals, and started to move all animals off of shows. But there were magicians, illusionists in Vegas who would make elephants appear and disappear. Now think about that. If an elephant appearing, how much harder is that than making a stick turn into a snake? It's way harder. So there are different explanations about the snakes. Some have said that there's certain snakes in that area that if you press on their neck, they'll go stiff, and that might have been what it is. There's a couple other options it could have been. But anyway, so for a theological reason, I don't think it was really happening. And because only God can do those kind of things. And that's why I don't think any psychic can do certain things. I don't think they can replicate anything Jesus did. The signs and wonders were proof of Jesus's deity. And so if anybody could do those same things, that goes against the apologetic for Jesus being the Son of God, God in the flesh.
So what would you say?
Oh, this guy can do that.
What would you say about those verses, the Bible verses that many Christians believe teach that false prophets can work genuine miracles? For example, I'll read a few of them. Matthew 24:24, for false Christ and false prophets will arise and perform great signs and wonders so as to lead astray, if possible, even the elect. Or 2 Thessalonians 2:9, the coming of the lawless one is by the activity of Satan with all power and false signs and wonders?
Yeah, well, those are great questions, and I do deal with those in my book. Um, I think one of the important things is going back to the Greek. The words are signs and signs, and the words are wonders. They're not for miracles, all right? And so Judas's kiss is used the same word. I believe it's the Greek word semeion, something like that. And so Judas's kiss was a sign. These other things are signs. They point to something, but they're false signs. They're pseudo signs. They're not real miracles. They're signs that lead to something. They lead to falsehood. And the earlier one about is basically the same thing about people being deceived, and because of these signs and wonders. They're signs and they're wonders. They cause wonder. They're signs, but they're not the miracles that Jesus did. And I'll give you an example of somebody who did this. There's a man in India, Satya Sai Baba. And Sai Baba, who has now passed away, was able to produce things out of his hands. One of the things he produced was like a sacred ash called vibhuti. And he had thousands and thousands of devotees, of people that followed him in India. And he was just performing magic tricks. I was at the conference at Biola years ago that Dr. Alan Gomes put together, and my presentation was about the book that you mentioned. So I went through and I performed that. I made ash come out of my hands to show them that I could do what Sai Baba did. And eventually, somebody who was recording Sai Baba found out that when he would produce necklaces and things like that out of his hands, they showed that one of his assistants came in with a tray, and as they came in with the tray, they had this in their hand, and Sai Baba took it like that, and now he had the necklace, and he was able to go like this and produce the necklace.
Hmm.
And he fooled many people. In fact, a Christian author wrote a book about Baba and believes that he did true supernatural acts.
Which
And
book? Do you remember which book that was?
I'm going to say, and because I read so many books and everything, I think it was a fellow named Tex Mars who wrote the book, something like Lord of the Air, something like that. I could be wrong on that. I'm just pulling that out of my memory, from 30, 40 years ago of me reading it. And I think I may mention that in my book. In my book, I tried to quote different authors about what they said, and then which showed that they really believed that Satan could do these things or the demons could do these things. Like one author said that these powers are scientific facts. Well, they're not scientific facts. James Randi did a great job in getting people teaching them to do things. So there were two young men that fooled scientists. They claimed that they had psychic ability, and it was called the Alpha Project. And so these two young men were performing sleight of hand, all fakery, and they had scientists believing they actually had psychic powers. And then Randy worked with a guy during the channeling rage, and his name was Carlos, and nobody knew Carlos was connected with Randy, but Carlos was a channeler. He'd do all these things, supposedly having entities speak through him. People believed that he had followers. And eventually he came out and showed it was fraudulent, and Randy was behind it. I just know people can be fooled.
Yeah. And I just pulled up from your book, some of the examples of authors arguing for psychic power you quote. You have Joanna Michelson here. She says the condemnation was not issued against mere frauds and windbags. She's talking about Scripture's condemnation of psychics. She says the condemnation was not issued against mere frauds and windbags. Incidentally, the Bible has always recognized the reality of phenomena produced by occultism. Then you quote Neil T. Anderson saying the mediums and spiritists that God warned against in Leviticus and Deuteronomy were not con artists, but people who possessed and passed on knowledge which didn't come through natural channels of perception. These people have opened themselves up to the spirit world and become channels of knowledge from Satan. So I wanted to ask you about that. I've have conversations with people all the time where they will tell me, they think that prophets, people, maybe even now, they believe they were false prophets, but that these false prophets actually gave them information that they could not have otherwise known. I've spoken with people who said, I used to be a part of the New Apostolic Reformation movement, and I would prophesy to people, and I would prophesy things about people that I know I wasn't hot reading because I was, they were the ones doing it. The person talking to me, they said I wasn't hot reading. I literally would have information put in my head about people that I could not have known, and it was very accurate information. So do you think that Satan or demons can implant thoughts in the heads of people, whether they're psychics, whether they claim to be prophets?
See, I'm a person who would say, "Oh, if someone told me that, I would say, what did you know about them? What did you tell them that you said you couldn't possibly know? What did you?" And it may not have been hot reading, but it could have been what we call cold reading. And cold reading is where you just say something. I've told people the name of their dog. I just took a guess and I got it right. And they're like, and then as you talk to people, their body language or other things, or so these people who don't think, who say, well, I did it. I know somehow I did it. There's that whole thing of like, what is, maybe it's intuition, or there's just things that are true about people. Most, like, I have a list of things like, 95% of women experience this. 75% of men are experiencing this. And those are things that can be used. I remember years ago, there was Bill Gothard's Basic Youth Institute, something like that, Basic Youth Institute or whatever it was that he was promoting. And in there was a list of things about people. And I got that list and I said, this is perfect for cold reading for me to use as I'm talking to people, because there's certain things that are just true. And so they may believe that they were, that this was coming to them somehow, but I would want to know specifics, because stories get so thrown out of shape, bent out of shape. Like I used to produce doves in my magic act. I used to produce a dove. The most I ever produced was 2 doves. But people would say, come to me later, like I had one lady say to me a few years ago on this, and they did this in the 70s. And she came to me about 6 years ago. She says, all those doves that you used to make appear, I just don't understand how you could do that with all those doves. Well, probably in the show she saw, I did 1 dove. And I deal with that again in the book, how we get these things bent out of shape. We forget, we add to it. But so with these people, I don't think, what can Satan do and what can he do? I know that I don't have to be like where Benny Hinn said Satan appeared in my bedroom one night, okay, and he tempted me or this, that, and the other thing. All I have to do is get on the internet and I'm tempted. All I have to do is turn my TV on and I can be tempted. I don't need Satan to be tempted. I think, Satan works through the world in the flesh. And so I think most of our problems are our flesh. The spiritual warfare, the spirit against the flesh. That's where I think they are. I don't necessarily think that Satan is putting thoughts in my mind. I'm really not I don't really buy into that he puts thoughts in my mind. I know that, there's doctrines of demons out there. I know that. And it could be false teaching. That's doctrine of demons. So I just think that, people who think they really did that, there's another explanation to it. See, here's one of the things I say too. I can't argue your experience, but I can argue your interpretation of your experience. I think that makes a lot of sense. I can't argue your experience because I wasn't there, but I can argue your interpretation of your experience. So I know I went back and forth with somebody who told me he saw somebody hold a spoon in their hand and that spoon went right over. Now, this was 30 years ago. They told me that that spoon went right over. And I said, are you sure that? And so the questions would be, whose spoon was that? See, I'm not going to buy into that unless I give them my spoon. That's one thing I want to do. I'll give them my spoon. I'm going to check their hands. I'm going to put them in a controlled situation. And that's what Andre did. He offered $25,000 to anyone who could perform in a controlled setting, who'd be able to perform a supernatural effect, whether that, especially like with Jesus, turning water to wine or levitating. But we were talking too about, spoons that would bend, or astral projection, where people claim that they could go out of their body, their spirit would go out of their body, and they could go to another dimension, another planet. And so Andre had a very simple thing to do, and he did it in Russia because the guy claimed he could astral project. He put a box, top, sides, back, only could see forward, put a box over this guy's head, had a blackboard behind him, and on that blackboard, on the other opposite side, Andre wrote a sentence. And he told the fellow, now go out in your astral body, go behind the blackboard, read it, come back, and tell us what I wrote. And so they did it with the fellow in Russia. The fellow came back in his body, supposedly. Andre said, what did you write? He said, God is love. Well, that was a great guess, but Andre wrote, Billy is a boy. You'll come up to other people who claim they can do astral projection, and they'll say, well, when I'm in my astral body, I can't read. So I'm not able to do that. And then you'll get the people who you say, we'll give you $25,000 if you do that. And they'll say, if I did that and I accepted the $25,000, God would take this ability away from me. And so my response was, well, you know what? There's a lot of charities out there that God would love. Why don't you do it? And we'll give your charity $25,000. So there's always excuse upon excuse. And so some people say, Terry, you're so cynical and everything like this. You'll never believe. Well, I've done the research. I've interviewed people. I've looked at medical reports, all these kind of things. And it's been weighed and found wanting in my experience. But yes, God can heal. Satan's our adversary. He's our foe. There are demons. There are angels. I don't know completely how they act, but I don't want to go beyond the biblical teaching. The biblical teaching of demonization, that we know that the woman or the man was, he had strength. He seemed to be out of his mind or whatever. It doesn't say he could levitate. It doesn't say he could read minds. The demon-possessed girl in the book of Acts, it says she made her masters much gain by fortune telling. Well, you know what? Right now, you can go on TV and the radio, and now there's a new thing out again, California psychics. You can pay $20 for like 10 minutes, and the best psychics, they're tested. The best psychics will tell you your future and about your future and give you a reading. They make a lot of money. It doesn't mean that they had any ability, and that's what I say about the demon-possessed girl in the book of Acts. Yes, she was demonized. She was demon-possessed. The Bible says that. But the Bible doesn't say she could read minds. See? So this is people interpreting it incorrectly or reading more into the passage than I believe is really there.
So in Job, we know that it seems that Satan sent a wind that collapsed a house that fell on Job's children, or there's also fire that came from heaven. And that fire, I think, hit the sheep and the servants, Job's sheep and servants. Does Satan have the ability to send wind or fire from heaven, as it may seem from that book?
Well, that's another great question. And I think a couple of the things you have to think about, like in anything, was that descriptive or prescriptive? So, in other words, was it a description of something that was done at one time, or was it something that can be done over and over and over again? So I look at Job's situation as very unique to him. The other thing about Job is this is interesting. You know, the scripture says he never sinned, that Job never sinned in all this. And Job says that it came from God, that all this came from God. And so that's been a discussion, controversy, whatever, of a theodicy about what does God do, good and evil. Did God do this or did Satan do this? And I think it was Calvin who said that Satan is God's hangman. In other words, God was in control of the whole thing, but Satan pulled the switch, so to speak. And so does Satan have the ability to do all these kind of things? Or did God do something special at that time? But what I know is Job never sinned when he said that this all came from God. So that's something that's got to be wrestled with. I'm not one to quickly move toward, I'm not going to move toward the fact that, we had some hurricanes and tornadoes and all that, and that God did it as judgment. I'm not going to move in that area, and I'm not going to move to the area that Satan did it. I have a booklet here, downstairs. It's called God is Speaking. And it was written by a friend of mine who lived in Sarasota back in like 1992. And he outlined all these things that had been happening with tornadoes and this, that, and the other thing. And he said, God is speaking just like he did in the Old Testament. And God is sending these things to happen. And you better do this, 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 and this to get through this next year or so. He wasn't saying dates when it was going to happen, but he said it's going to happen. Well, here we are. That was 92. So where we are, we're 34 years later, and none of that ever happened. So I just, I get concerned about, again, making these leaps of logic without any great reason to do it. And again, that's why people will say, well, Terry, you don't believe in the supernatural. Well, yes, I do, 100 times over. I probably believe in the supernatural more than some of the people who accuse me of not believing it. I'm just careful with what I define as supernatural.
Yeah, and I'm looking up a passage in Job here because I've been reading in the book of Job just in my own Bible study time recently. But we know that Satan requested permission from God in order to inflict Job. He had to request permission. Did he give Satan some kind of permission to do this in this particular instance? But that can't necessarily be universalized to everyone else. Is that kind of where you were going with that?
Yeah, that's where I'm at, and I think if you look somewhere else, I'd forget what the verse is. I'm thinking like 2:6, but I may be really wrong on that. Where it does say, it says Job never sinned, and he attributed it all to God. And it's interesting to me, since God says spare his life, like God, really God couldn't stop Satan from taking his life. If Satan wanted to take his life, God had to ask Satan, please don't take his life. Satan, please don't take his life. It doesn't connect with me from my theology of God, So maybe it's problematic. I don't know that it's that problematic. It's just the secret things are only known to God, And so some of this I don't know. I'm not going to pretend to know. But as I look at this passage and as I try to understand, good and evil, and I know Dr. Doug Guyvett has done work on all that. He's probably a much better one. Well, I'm not going to say probably. He's a much better one to deal with all that. I've never asked him about that. I should ask him, what's his perspective on Job and all that.
Yeah, well,
I'm going to ask him.
Yeah, and then the other question I have is I've had people talk to me about fears that they or others have had that maybe it was demons inflicting that sickness on them because maybe they had dabbled in the occult in the past. Or there's talk of, well, if you have occultic objects in your house, that can open you up to demonic attack and that can cause health problems. Do you have any thoughts about Satan's ability?
Well, there's, again, that, we get in such an area of conjecture. I'll tell you this story. So a Satanist moves down my street. I used to pastor a church, okay? And a Satanist moves down my street, and he's really against me and all this kind of stuff, and he wants to do something. So he bakes chocolate chip cookies because I love chocolate chip cookies. And he decides that he's going to send demons into those chocolate chip cookies. So he does a ritual. He sends demons in those chocolate chip cookies, and he brings them to my church. And we have a potluck, and I love those chocolate chip cookies. He says, Pastor Terry, here, have some chocolate chip cookies. And I eat those chocolate chip cookies, and all of a sudden, I'm mean to my wife, I'm mean to my kids, I'm swearing, I'm doing all this stuff. Well, you know why? Because I ingested a demon that's now in me, and I'm demon-possessed. Now, think about that. But that's where this can go when people start saying that demons are in objects. What stops a demon from going into a chocolate chip cookie that I'm going to eat, or a Satanist sending it into a cookie, all this kind of thing. So I just think that some of this thinking is just wild. It ends up with wild speculation. When in my research, and I believe, and I think I have this in my book again, Paul Meyer, who was from the Meyer-Manerth Clinic, that was in Dallas years and years ago, and I believe he's still in practice with psychology and that. He wrote about 10 years before my book, he wrote in another book that about demon possession, and he said, I found that demons were allergic to a certain medication. I don't remember what it is off the top of my head. He said, because after I gave my patients this medication, they no longer had those problems that they were having, those issues. And he said, it must be that if they were demonized, the demons had to be, allergic to that. And so they left. And I just, when I read that, I just laughed about that. I said, well, that's a great line. So when I wrote my book 10 years after, I think he said that the first time, I said, have you come across anybody that you really know is demon possessed? He said, no, I don't. So this whole thing is so, again, I say full of conjecture, people thinking, like, oh, I'm sick because I have an object here that came from overseas that a missionary brought me. There are stories, and I wrote about all this stuff in other things that I had, little articles about people throwing their objects from missionaries into the fire, and you could hear them screaming. The objects were screaming, the demons were screaming and all that. And so I did research on this wood and all this kind of thing, and there's woods that will make noises when you put it in the fire. It'll make a weird sound and all this. And so I think that's it's like Occam's razor. What's the simplest definition? And so for me, I look at the simplest definition for certain things, and I go with that. But it doesn't mean that I don't believe in demons.
I mentioned this, I think, earlier, about a common mistake people make, that just because you can't explain it doesn't mean it was a miracle. And I think my guests have probably already noticed that we've been going back and forth now in our talking now about supernatural power, whether people are attributing the supernatural power to God, whether they're not attributing the supernatural power to God, they're attributing the power to Satan or demons. So we've been kind of going back and forth in our discussion here. But a common mistake that people make, just because they can't explain it doesn't mean it was a miracle. And in your book, you quote someone explaining that there are 4 natural forces that are behind all physical interactions, and these have to be ruled out before going to claims of the supernatural. So those 4 forces are gravity, weak nuclear force, strong nuclear force, and electromagnetism. And the person you cited who was pointing this out, I think they said something like, Like most people couldn't even identify what those four natural forces are, let alone understand that those forces are responsible for all physical interactions. I was wondering if you could speak to that a little bit.
Well, I believe his name was Al Seckel, a physicist, and he responds to people who are saying it had to be supernatural. And he says, well, then if you think it's supernatural, you must know it's not natural. So what are the four forces? What are the four natural forces that it isn't? And people don't know. They can't explain that. And so the idea is, if you don't know what the natural forces are, why do you jump right away to this has got to be supernatural? It may be natural, but you don't know what that natural force is that's happening. So when I read someone's mind, supposedly, and they want to say that's supernatural, or I find someone's card that they put into a deck that I say, pick a card, they look at it, they put it back in the deck, and I tell them what it is, and they go, come away and say, that's all going to be supernatural. That's only because they don't know the natural thing that I'm doing. See, I'm doing something very, very natural that, like I say, any 8-year-old could do with 20 years practice. I could, like in Andre Cole's show, amazing. He levitated, one of the most beautiful levitations I've ever seen. He would levitate, one-man levitation. He'd levitate up in the air, cross his legs, he'd levitate up in the air, and then an assistant would bring out a ring, and they'd go up with the ring right from the bottom, right up over him and out like that. It was unbelievable. And I assisted on stage with that a few times. It was surreal. The music that was playing, the lights that were flashing on the prop that he sat on, him wearing white. He started out with his hands on candlesticks, and then he would do this, and people sometimes got bent out of shape about that. And then he would go up in the air. It was unbelievable. If I took you backstage during that time, within 20 seconds or less, you'd know how he did that. But it was a great trick, great secret. And a woman in Canada one time thought he was demonized, and she stood up and tried to cast demons out of him while he was levitating. So, yeah, people don't understand, that it doesn't have to be supernatural. They have to realize, I just don't understand it. I have to admit to you, I've been in magic 55 years. I'm seeing things now that fool me, because magic has taken some big steps in the last 10 years. And I'll see something and, I have to admit, wow, I don't know how that was done. Now, I might be able to say there's a couple ways, there's 3 or 4 ways that could be done. But I might not be right. I could be completely wrong on that. And there might be some that I would say, I have no clue how they would even do that. So, but I don't jump to the fact that, that they sold their soul to the devil. There was a book that I talk about in my book called, it was a manuscript, Hurling the Headlines, by a man named David Hoy. And David Hoy was a believer. David Hoy wrote a book on gospel magic, but he ended up going a different direction for different reasons, and he became a psychic. But he was I think he called himself a fake psychic at times, something like that. But Hoy wrote this book, Hurling the Headlines, and what he would say is, if you toss out 10 headlines, 1 or 2 of those may happen. And I've done this. 1 or 2 of those may happen. And people, when that happens, they'll remember that. They'll forget the other 8 that you made that didn't happen. And I was in a discussion with another author, Christian author, Dr. Gary North, who wrote a number of books. And Gary North wrote a book. It was first, I think, called Unholy Spirits, or that was anyway, Unholy Spirits. He had a chapter on David Hoy. He believed David Hoy was a real psychic and that he really had supernatural power. And I have a series of letters with David Hoy. with Gary North, to try to explain to him that David Hoy was a trickster, he was a mentalist. He was just like me. And he would not hear it. North would not hear it. He wouldn't listen to it. He was very negative. He started to attack me and Andre about doing magic, like something about us being at the gates of hell, welcoming people in, something like that. I have all this still. And he wouldn't believe it. And so Hoy was a fake. He wrote the book, hurling the headline. So I made like 20 predictions, and I sent those to Hoy. And I said, here's my predictions. And I had, one was about a plane crash, that actually there was a plane crash that took place. So it's just, these people can throw these things out, and whether they're non-Christians or whether they're Christian prophets, supposedly, they can toss things out like this is going to happen or whatever. I have a book that gives me statistics tells me like when plane crashes occur, when coal mines can cave in, when you name it, when there can be problems with the trains and this kind of thing. And it shows you the dates and when these things have taken place. And so if I would choose to do that kind of thing, I could come out tonight and I could say, okay, let's see, this hasn't happened for a while. I'm going to make a prediction. And, boom. I mean, we've had different plane tragedies here, catastrophes in the last couple of weeks. So if I had thrown that out a week ago, I could be, say, oh, I told you, I saw it.
I appreciate all you have shared. I think this will help give my listeners a lot more to think about, a lot more insight into, what magicians are able to do, what illusionists are able to do. There's actually a quote in your book where you say most individuals are not aware of what those trained in the art of illusion can accomplish. And then you also make a point, which you made earlier, that changing a stick to a snake is child's play compared to what modern magicians can do. And so I think it will be enlightening for people to keep all this in mind when they are presented with so-called miracles, so-called amazingly accurate prophecies from people in this new Apostolic Reformation movement, and not just think, well, because I can't explain it, therefore, they must be a real prophet. They must be giving genuine prophecies. They must be working genuine miracles.
Yeah. And I would say this, if you allow comments on this podcast here that I've done, I have no doubt that there will be people that will say that, I'm all wrong on this kind of thing. So I expect to see that, hear it. It comes with the territory, so to speak, when you try to share this kind of information.
Yeah, of course. And many people will accuse you of just thinking God can't work miracles. And as you said,
Right.
Not believing in demons and the supernatural and all those things. And I think you've made very clear that's not the case, but nonetheless, that those kind of responses are definitely forthcoming. One thing I think might help my listeners is a distinction that you make in your books between the supernatural and the supernormal. So you're not saying that Satan can't do supernormal things. You're saying that he can't do supernatural things. Those would be things, from what I understand, the way you define it, that the supernatural things are the things only God can do. But can you explain what you mean by that Satan can do supernormal things?
So the question with supernormal and supernatural, I guess I would try to explain it like this. The man, the demoniac of the Gadarenes was definitely demonized or demon possessed. He had strength that was beyond the normal person. So I guess we could say that was supernormal. When people start claiming that people who are demonized levitate, that would be supernatural, because that would go against one of the known natural forces that we talked about, which is gravitation. So supernatural would be levitation, which on the old TV show 2020, back sometime in, I believe, the 80s, they televised what was supposedly the first exorcism ever on TV. And a Catholic priest was going to exorcise a girl they named Gina. And Gina was supposedly able to levitate. She could speak in unknown languages. She had amazing strength, and she knew things about people that she couldn't know normally. That's what they said. But they never showed her levitating. They put ropes around her. They tied her to a chair so she wouldn't go up in the air. But the better way to have done this, to prove something to us, would have been to tie ropes around her wrists and let her go up like a Macy's Day Parade balloon and bring her down as she went up. But they put her around the chair, which supposedly kept her from levitating. So a levitation would be supernatural. That strength would be supernormal, which even a Christian group that was known as the Power Team was able to do. They were able to break chains. They were able to bend rebar. So I think that's the best way I could put it. If someone's demonized, could they do certain things? Well, based on biblical material, I would say yes. I would say yes, they could do, but I don't want to go beyond the Bible. I don't want to go extra biblical and say, well, because the newest exorcist on the block says that this person was doing this, and this. And I question all those kind of things that they say they were, doing those things. Again, it's me and questioning their interpretation, not their experience, but their interpretation of that experience.
Okay, well, thank you for that. And I think that's a great place to end this, is we don't want to go beyond Scripture. And I think that's we see happening so much when people talk about what Satan's able to do, what demons are able to do, the ways they may empower people. It's important to look at what Scripture actually says, but be careful not to go beyond the data that we actually do see in Scripture and bring things to it that are things that we've heard, just from other Christians, from Christian circles, just
Right.
Ideas that are floating around out there, but that we're very careful not to go beyond the text. I want to thank you again for coming on. I was so looking forward to this discussion, and I would love to just keep picking your brain on this topic for hours, and I probably will, if that's okay. I'll probably be contacting you down the road and asking you follow-up questions, because it's been such a treat to be able to talk to you about these topics, and such important topics where so many people are being led astray by bad teaching. But this is the book. It's called Astrology and Psychic Phenomena. I highly recommend that you get it. It's written in kind of an outline form, so it's very dense. It's full of argumentation and scriptural support for your argumentation.
Yeah, well, thanks, Holly. I appreciate you having me on. As you can tell, I could talk about this for hours because I spent so much time researching it and talking to people, and I have so many concerns. I think I told you with the book, they only wanted 30,000 words. When I was done with everything, I had 90,000 words. So 60,000 words, 2/3 of the book never saw print. Mm-hmm. And that's why I could just keep going on and on. But I wrote it to be helpful, that it would be beneficial to people that maybe have never studied all this, but have heard a lot of stories. So, yeah, thanks a lot. It was great being with you. I love it. And if anybody wants to contact me, I'm more than happy to, write back and all that
can you
kind of thing.
tell people the best way to get a hold of you? And also, if people are interested, are you still doing your show? What was it called?
The Extrasensory Deception of Terry Holley. Yes, I'm still doing it, and I recreate fraudulent psychic phenomena. But I don't, after the show's over, I don't act like a psychic. I step out of that role. But it's important to pretend I'm a psychic to get it all across.
Yeah. I mean, that would be great for churches if they want to teach their people to be more discerning. Is there a way that they can reach you?
Well, I'll give my email if it's okay with you.
That's fine with me if you're okay with putting it out there.
Okay. Yeah, I'm okay with putting it out there. And if you don't hear back from me within a couple days, then it would have gone in my spam. But I'll write to critics and anybody. And if you have any thoughts or you have something that you want me to try to check into, I could, if I can, I would check into it. So my name is Terry Holley, and my email is TerryHolley_HOLLEY@hotmail.com.
Okay, and I will make a note to include your email as well in the show notes for people in case they are driving and listening to this podcast and didn't get a chance to write that down. But thank you so much. I hope we can continue this discussion.
I'd love it. Let me know.
Okay, thanks, Terry. Bye.
Bye-bye.